The winter of 1886 would forever change the course of Sarah Elizabeth Harrington's life in ways she could never have imagined. What began as a simple act of human compassion during a merciless Dakota blizzard would ultimately challenge everything she believed about courage, loyalty, and the invisible lines that society draws between us and them. In 7 days, her quiet existence as a frontier schoolteacher would be transformed into something far more dangerous and far more meaningful than she had ever dared to dream. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The territory of Dakota stretched endlessly under a pewter sky that promised nothing but trouble. Sarah Elizabeth Harrington stood at the single window of her one-room schoolhouse, watching the wind bend the prairie grass into submission as storm clouds gathered on the northern horizon. At 26, she possessed the kind of quiet determination that frontier life demanded, steady hands that never wavered when teaching reluctant children to read, clear green eyes that could maintain discipline with a single glance, and auburn hair she kept braided with the practical efficiency of someone who had learned that every minute counted when winter threatened. The schoolhouse occupied a lonely position 3 miles outside of Cedar Rapids, a settlement that existed primarily to serve the growing number of homesteaders who had claimed land under the Homestead Act. Built of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and prairie grass, the building served not only as Sarah's workplace, but as her home, with modest living. Quarters attached to the main classroom. The arrangement suited her perfectly. She valued the independence it provided and the sense of purpose that came from educating the children of families who were building new lives from nothing. Sarah had arrived in Dakota Territory 2 years earlier, fleeing the suffocating expectations of Boston society, where her father, Judge Marcus Harrington, had planned a future that felt more like a prison sentence. Marriage to a wealthy banker's son, a life of social obligations and meaningless conversations, a world where her intelligence was seen as an inconvenience rather than an asset. The decision to answer an advertisement for a frontier schoolteacher had shocked her family and scandalized their social circle, but it had given Sarah something she had never possessed in her privileged upbringing: the freedom to define her own worth. The children of Cedar Rapids came to her classroom from homesteads, scattered across miles of unforgiving landscape. Swedish immigrants whose children struggled with English but excelled at mathematics. German families whose dedication to education impressed even Sarah's exacting standards. Irish settlers whose children brought a love of storytelling that enriched every lesson. And increasingly, families from the eastern states who had come west seeking opportunities that the established cities no longer offered. Sarah's teaching methods were unconventional by the standards of her Boston education, but perfectly suited to frontier realities. She taught practical skills alongside traditional subjects: how to calculate land measurements and crop yields, how to write letters that would bring supplies from distant suppliers, how to read weather patterns and seasonal changes. Her students learned history through the stories of their own families' journeys west, geography through the practical knowledge of routes and territories, and literature through books that spoke to their experiences of building new lives in challenging circumstances. The relationship between Sarah and the community of Cedar Rapids had evolved from initial skepticism to grudging acceptance to genuine respect. The settlers had expected a refined Eastern lady who would quickly flee back to civilization at the first sign of hardship. Instead, they found a woman who could manage a classroom of 30 children ranging from age 6 to 16, who could repair her own roof when winter storms damaged it, and who could treat minor injuries and illnesses with the competence of someone who had learned that self-reliance was not optional in frontier life. Mayor James Patterson, a former cavalry officer, who had founded Cedar Rapids after his military service, had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters. His wife, Margaret, organized the monthly school board meetings where Sarah reported on her students' progress and requested supplies for the coming term. Dr. Henry Morrison, the settlement's only physician, frequently consulted with Sarah about the children's health and had come to rely on her observations about patterns of illness or injury that might indicate broader community health concerns. But Sarah's relationship with the broader territorial community was more complex. Dakota Territory in 1886 was a region in transition, caught between the traditional ways of the Native American tribes who had lived there for generations and the advancing wave of European American settlement that was transforming the landscape. The tensions between these two worlds created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty, where misunderstandings could escalate into violence with terrifying speed. The Lakota Sioux, whose ancestral lands encompassed much of the territory, had been increasingly confined to reservations following a series of treaties that most settlers viewed as necessary for progress, and most Native Americans saw as systematic theft. The recent conflicts, including the tragedy at Wounded Knee, just 4 years prior, had left deep wounds on both sides that time had not yet begun to heal. Fear and mistrust dominated the relationship between the two communities, creating an environment where any contact between whites and Lakota was viewed with suspicion by both sides. Sarah had encountered this tension personally during her first winter in Dakota Territory. A small group of Lakota hunters had approached the schoolhouse during a particularly harsh storm, seeking shelter and food. Her instinct had been to offer assistance. They were clearly suffering from exposure and hunger, but several prominent settlers had later criticized her decision, warning that such kindness could be interpreted as weakness and might encourage further incidents. The criticism had stung, not because Sarah doubted her choice, but because it revealed the depth of prejudice and fear that shaped frontier attitudes. Despite the warnings, Sarah had continued to maintain her own principles about human dignity and compassion. When Lakota families occasionally appeared near the settlement, she treated them with the same courtesy she would show any visitor. When her students asked questions about the Native Americans they sometimes saw in the distance, she provided factual answers rather than repeating the inflammatory stories that circulated through the community. This approach had earned her a reputation as someone who was either admirably principled or dangerously naive, depending on who was offering the opinion. The morning that would change everything began with troubling signs that Sarah recognized. From her 2 years of frontier experience, the wind had shifted to the northwest during the night, bringing with it the sharp, metallic scent that preceded the most dangerous winter storms. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sunset, and the sky had taken on the peculiar greenish-gray color that old-timers claimed could predict blizzards with greater accuracy than any barometer. Sarah's students arrived at the schoolhouse with reports from their families about livestock being brought in early and storm preparations being accelerated. Young Timothy Patterson, the mayor's 8-year-old son, breathlessly reported that his father had sent riders to warn the most distant homesteads about the approaching weather. Emma Lindquist, whose Swedish family had homesteaded the previous spring, mentioned that her grandfather was reading signs in the wind patterns that reminded him of the legendary blizzards of his homeland. By mid-morning, Sarah had made the decision that would place her squarely in the path of destiny. The storm was approaching faster than anticipated, and several of her students faced dangerous journeys home to distant homesteads. She dismissed class early, helping families coordinate transportation and ensuring that children who lived in the same direction could travel together for safety. The schoolhouse had been empty for only an hour when the first snowflakes began to fall. Within minutes, the gentle flakes had become a driving curtain of white that reduced visibility to mere yards. Sarah moved through her modest living quarters, checking supplies and securing windows against the wind that was beginning to howl. Around the building's corners, with increasing intensity, she had just finished banking the fire in her wood stove when she heard something that made her blood freeze, a sound barely audible above the storm's roar, but unmistakably human. A child's cry, weak and desperate. Coming from somewhere outside in the blizzard, Sarah's first instinct was to dismiss the sound as imagination or perhaps the wind playing tricks with the storm's many voices. But the cry came again, closer this time, and filled with the kind of terror that no adult could mistake for anything other than genuine distress. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed her heavy wool coat and boots, wrapping a thick scarf around her face before opening the door to peer into the swirling white chaos. The wind hit her with physical force, driving snow into her eyes and stealing her breath. For a moment, she could see nothing but the impenetrable wall of white that the blizzard had created. Then movement caught her attention. A small, dark shape struggling through the snow, approximately 50 yards from the schoolhouse. The figure was clearly a child, but moving with the erratic, stumbling gait of someone whose strength was nearly exhausted. Even at that distance, Sarah could see that the child was inadequately dressed for the brutal conditions and was in immediate danger of collapse. The decision that would alter the course of her life took less than a second to make. Sarah plunged into the blizzard, fighting against wind that threatened to knock her down with every step. The snow was already deep enough to make walking treacherous, and the temperature was dropping so rapidly that her exposed skin began to sting within moments. The child had fallen by the time Sarah reached him, for it was clearly a boy, perhaps, 10 years old, with the distinctive features and clothing that marked him as Lakota. His dark hair was crusted with ice, his lips were blue with cold, and his small body was shaking with violent tremors that indicated the advanced stages of hypothermia. But his eyes, when they met Sarah's, burned with an intelligence and dignity that spoke of courage far beyond his years. In that moment, as Sarah knelt in the driving snow beside a dying Lakota child, she understood that she was facing a choice that would define not only her character, but her entire future. The boy's life hung in the balance, requiring immediate action if he was to survive. But saving him would mean crossing social and cultural boundaries that her community considered sacred, potentially exposing herself to criticism, ostracism, or worse. The child looked up at her with eyes that held no expectation of rescue, only a quiet acceptance of whatever fate awaited him. He had been taught, Sarah realized, that white settlers were more likely to be enemies than saviors. Yet he made no attempt to resist as she gathered him into her arms, his small body feeling frighteningly light and cold against her chest. The journey back to the schoolhouse became a battle for survival that tested every ounce of Sarah's strength and determination. The wind seemed determined to drive them off course, and the deepening snow made each step a monumental effort. The boy had lost consciousness by the time they reached the door, his breathing so shallow that Sarah feared she might already be too late. Once inside, Sarah's teaching experience and frontier practicality took control. She stripped away the child's wet clothing, noting that his garments were well made, but insufficient for the brutal conditions he had endured. His moccasins were beautifully crafted, but offered little protection against deep snow and sub-zero temperatures. Everything about his appearance suggested that he had been traveling when the storm struck, caught away from shelter by the blizzard's sudden intensity. Sarah wrapped the boy in her warmest blankets and positioned him near the wood stove, gradually warming his body while being careful not to shock his system with too rapid a temperature change. She had learned basic cold-weather medical care from Dr. Morrison, who had emphasized that hypothermia victims required patient, careful treatment to avoid potentially fatal complications. As she worked to save the child's life, Sarah found herself Studying his face with growing fascination, even unconscious and nearly frozen, he possessed a natural dignity that spoke of good breeding and careful upbringing. His clothing, though simple, showed the kind of detailed craftsmanship that indicated a family of some status within Lakota society. This was not a lost or abandoned child, but someone whose absence would be noticed and whose rescue would have consequences she could not yet imagine. The blizzard raged outside with increasing fury, creating a world where normal rules and expectations were suspended. In this isolated bubble of warmth and safety, Sarah found herself caring for a Lakota child whose very presence in her home violated every social convention of frontier society. She was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, making a choice that would force her to examine everything she believed about justice, compassion, and the courage required to do what was right, regardless of social consequences. As the boy's breathing gradually strengthened and color slowly returned to his cheeks, Sarah realized that she had committed herself to something far larger than a simple rescue. She had chosen to see this child as a human being worthy of saving, regardless of the racial and cultural boundaries that divided their peoples. It was a choice that would soon test her in ways she could never have anticipated, challenging not only her place in frontier society, but her understanding of what it truly meant to live according to one's deepest principles. The storm showed no signs of abating, and Sarah understood that she might be caring for her unexpected guest for days. As she settled into a chair beside the unconscious boy, watching over his recovery through the long night ahead, she had no way of knowing that 7 miles away, a Lakota war party was already organizing a search for their missing chief's son, or that her act of compassion would soon bring her face to face with forces that would transform her quiet life as a frontier schoolteacher into something far more dangerous and far more meaningful than anything she had ever dared to imagine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The child stirred just before dawn on the second day, his dark eyes opening to focus on Sarah's face with an alertness that surprised her. She had been dozing fitfully in the wooden chair beside the makeshift bed, jerking awake at the slightest change in his breathing. Now, as consciousness returned to the boy, Sarah found herself looking into eyes that held a mixture of wariness, intelligence, and something else, a dignity that seemed far beyond his apparent age. "Mitakuye," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying a weight of meaning that Sarah didn't understand. He attempted to sit up, then winced as movement reminded him of his ordeal. His gaze moved quickly around the unfamiliar surroundings, taking in the schoolhouse's simple furnishings, the books lining the shelves, the slate board covered with yesterday's arithmetic lessons. Sarah moved slowly, understanding instinctively that sudden movements might frighten him. "You're safe," she said gently, keeping her voice low and calm. "You were caught in the blizzard. I found you outside and brought you in." She gestured toward the window where snow continued to fall, though less violently than the previous night. "The storm is still too dangerous for travel." The boy's eyes followed her gestures, and she could see him processing this information with careful thought. When he spoke again, it was in accented but clear English that revealed a formal education. "You are the teacher, woman. I have heard of you from the trading post." His pronunciation was precise, suggesting someone who had learned English as a second language but had mastered it thoroughly. Sarah felt a flutter of surprise and concern. If this child knew of her reputation, then others in the Lakota community were aware of her existence and activities. The implications of this knowledge were troubling. It suggested a level of observation and intelligence gathering that most settlers would find threatening. "What's your name?" she asked, offering him a cup of warm broth she had prepared during the night. The boy hesitated, clearly weighing whether to trust her with personal information. Finally, he replied, "I am called Joseph Crow Feather by the white teachers at the mission school, but my real name, my Lakota name, is Wanblee Gleska, Spotted Eagle." The distinction he made between his two names revealed the complex world he inhabited, caught between traditional Lakota culture and the enforced assimilation of government schools. Sarah absorbed this information while helping him sip the broth. The fact that he attended a mission school explained his English proficiency, but it also raised new questions about how he had come to be alone in a blizzard so far from any educational institution. "Joseph," she said, using the name he had offered first, "how did you come to be out in such dangerous weather? Where were you traveling?" The boy's expression grew guarded, and Sarah could see him calculating how much truth to reveal. "I was returning to my people," he said finally. "There was trouble at the school. I left to bring word to my father." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "The white teachers, they do not understand our ways. They punish children for speaking our language, for remembering our stories. I could not stay silent when they hurt my cousin for singing a healing song for his sick grandmother." The picture Joseph painted was one Sarah had heard whispered about in conversations among the more liberal-minded settlers. The government's policy of forced assimilation included removing Native American children from their families and placing them in schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. Students were forbidden to speak their native languages, practice their traditions, or maintain connections to their cultural heritage. Sarah had always found the policy troubling, but hearing about it from someone who had lived through its harsh realities brought the injustice into sharp focus. "You walked out of the school in winter?" Sarah asked, unable to hide her concern. "That's incredibly dangerous, especially for someone traveling alone." Joseph's chin lifted with pride that reminded Sarah forcibly that she was speaking to someone who came from a warrior culture. "I am not afraid of winter. My grandfather taught me to read the signs, to find shelter, to survive in conditions that would kill white men. But this storm," he gestured toward the window, "this storm came faster than the old signs predicted. Even the animals were caught unprepared." As Joseph grew stronger throughout the day, Sarah found herself drawn into conversations that challenged many of her assumptions about Lakota culture and the conflicts between Native Americans and settlers. The boy possessed a sophisticated understanding of both worlds, able to explain the cultural practices and beliefs of his people, while also demonstrating his familiarity with white society's expectations and limitations. "Your people fear us," Joseph observed during one of their talks, "because you do not understand us. You see our warriors and think only of war. You see our ceremonies and think of savagery. But we are no different from you in our love for our children, our respect for our elders, our desire to live in peace on the land of our ancestors." Sarah found herself nodding, recognizing the truth in his words. "And your people must fear us as well," she replied, "because our coming has brought so much change and loss." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow that continued to fall. "My father says that fear makes enemies of people who could be friends. He says that understanding requires courage from both sides, courage to see past the stories we tell ourselves about each other." The wisdom in these words, coming from a child who could not be more than 11 years old, struck Sarah with unexpected force. She began to understand that she was not simply caring for a lost boy, but for someone who had been raised with a sophistication and depth of cultural knowledge that rivaled anything she had encountered in her privileged Boston upbringing. As the second day progressed, Joseph revealed more about his family and his place within Lakota society. His father was Red Cloud Walker, a respected leader who had been attempting to negotiate peaceful solutions to the increasing tensions between the Lakota and the expanding white settlements. His mother, Singing Dove, was known throughout the territory for her skill as a healer and her work in preserving traditional Lakota knowledge and stories. "My father chose my English name carefully," Joseph explained, as Sarah helped him with a simple meal. Joseph was a leader who saved his people during a time of great hardship. "My father hopes that I will learn to build bridges between our peoples, to find ways for us to live together without destroying each other." Sarah realized that she was caring for someone who represented hope for peaceful coexistence between two cultures that seemed increasingly destined for conflict. The irony was not lost on her that this bridge building had begun with her decision to rescue a freezing child, acting purely on human compassion rather than political calculation. The third day brought a break in the weather, though snow continued to fall intermittently and temperatures remained dangerously cold. Joseph was strong enough to move around the schoolhouse, and Sarah watched with fascination as he examined her books, maps, and teaching materials with the curiosity of someone genuinely interested in learning. "You teach all these children together?" he asked, studying the desks arranged in neat rows. "The big ones and the little ones, the boys and the girls." Sarah nodded, explaining her methods for managing a mixed-age classroom and adapting lessons to different skill levels. Joseph listened with intense attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own educational experiences and the stark differences between white and Lakota approaches to learning. "In our way," he said, "children learn by watching, by listening to stories, by practicing skills until they become natural. The old ones teach by example, and the young ones learn by trying, making mistakes, being corrected gently. But at the mission school, learning happens only by sitting still, by repeating words that have no meaning to us, by forgetting everything our grandparents taught us." The conversation deepened Sarah's understanding of the cultural destruction that government policies were inflicting on Native American communities. She began to see how the forced separation of children from their families was not just an individual tragedy, but a systematic assault on entire ways of life that had sustained these peoples for generations. That afternoon, Joseph demonstrated some of the practical skills his grandfather had taught him, showing Sarah how to read weather signs in the movement of clouds and the behavior of birds, how to conserve heat more efficiently in the schoolhouse's simple construction, and how to prepare certain foods that would provide better nutrition. Or during harsh winter conditions, Sarah found herself learning as much as she was teaching, gaining insights into sustainable living practices that her Eastern education had never included. She began to understand that the Lakota possessed sophisticated knowledge systems that white society too often dismissed as primitive superstition. "Your grandfather sounds like a wise teacher," Sarah observed as Joseph showed her how to bank the fire for maximum overnight heat retention. "He was the wisest man I knew," Joseph replied, his voice carrying the weight of loss. "He died last winter, during the hunger time when the government rations did not come. Before he passed, he made me promise to remember everything he taught. Me to keep the old knowledge alive, even as the world changes around us." The responsibility this child carried, preserving cultural knowledge while navigating the demands of an education system designed to erase that same culture, struck Sarah as an almost impossible burden. Yet Joseph seemed to bear it with a maturity and sense of purpose that commanded her deep respect. As evening approached on the third day, Sarah noticed changes in Joseph's behavior that suggested growing anxiety. He spent long periods looking out the window, his body tense with a watchfulness that spoke of someone expecting important developments. When she asked about his concerns, He was initially reluctant to answer. "My people will be looking for me," he said finally. "When I did not return from the school, when the storm came, they will know that something has happened. They will send search parties, warriors who know how to find tracks even after a blizzard." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Will they think that settlers had something to do with your disappearance?" Joseph's expression grew troubled. "Some will. There have been incidents, children who disappeared near white settlements and were never found. My father will counsel patience and careful investigation, but others—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Others may assume the worst and act accordingly." The implications of Joseph's words hit Sarah with sudden frightening clarity. Her act of rescue could easily be misinterpreted as kidnapping by Lakota warriors who found their chief's son in the home of a white woman. The cultural misunderstandings that plagued relations between the two peoples could transform her compassionate act into the spark for a violent confrontation that would destroy any hope of peaceful coexistence. "How long before they find us?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Joseph studied the weather patterns visible through the window, his young face serious with concentration. "The storm will slow them, but it will not stop them. My father's best trackers can follow, sign that others cannot see. If the wind dies down tomorrow, they could be here by evening. If it continues like this," he gestured at the still falling snow, "perhaps another day or two." Sarah realized that she now faced a crisis that extended far beyond the simple challenge of caring for a lost child. She was about to be confronted by Lakota warriors who might interpret her actions as hostile, placing her in a situation where cultural misunderstanding could lead to violence despite her innocent intentions. The comfortable isolation of her schoolhouse, which had always felt like protection, now seemed like a trap. She was too far from Cedar Rapids to summon help quickly, and even if she could reach the settlement, she was not certain that the settlers' response would improve the situation. Fear and prejudice could easily escalate a misunderstanding into a tragedy that would shatter any hope of peaceful relations between the communities. As Sarah prepared for another night of watching over Joseph, she understood that her simple act of human compassion had set in motion events that could reshape the entire relationship between whites and Lakota in the territory. The next few days would test not only her courage and wisdom, but her ability to bridge two worlds that seemed increasingly determined to destroy each other. Outside, the wind continued to howl around the schoolhouse. But Sarah knew that when it finally died down, it would bring with it visitors whose intentions and expectations she could not predict. Visitors who would judge her actions by standards she was only beginning to understand. The fourth morning dawned with an ominous stillness that made Sarah's skin prickle with foreboding. The blizzard had finally exhausted itself during the night, leaving behind a landscape transformed into an alien world of pristine white that stretched unbroken to the horizon. The silence was so complete it seemed to press against the windows of the schoolhouse like a living thing, broken only by the occasional crack of settling timber and the soft whisper of snow sliding from the roof. Joseph stood at the window, his body rigid with tension that spoke of knowledge Sarah didn't possess. His young face had taken on the focused intensity of a hunter reading signs in the wilderness, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that chilled her more than the winter air. "They are coming," he said simply. "Today, before the sun reaches its highest point, they will be here." Sarah moved to stand beside him, scanning the empty prairie for any sign of movement. To her untrained eyes, the landscape appeared completely lifeless, an endless expanse of snow broken only by the occasional fence post or windbreak. "How can you tell?" "I don't see anything." Joseph pointed toward a distant ridge where bare cottonwood trees stood like dark sentinels against the white sky. "Watch the ravens," he instructed. "See how they circle and call? They are following something that moves through the snow. And there," he indicated a subtle depression in the snow's surface, invisible to Sarah until he drew her attention to it. "The wind patterns show where many horses have passed, even though fresh snow covers their tracks." As Sarah studied the landscape with Joseph's guidance, she began to perceive signs that her civilized education had never taught her to recognize. The behavior of distant birds, the way snow had settled in certain patterns, the almost imperceptible shadows that suggested disturbance beneath the pristine surface, all of it told a story of movement and purpose that was rushing toward them with inexorable certainty. "How many?" she asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving across the terrain with practiced assessment. "Perhaps 20 warriors, maybe more. My father would not send a small party to search for his son in dangerous territory. He would send enough men to handle any trouble they might encounter." The image of 20 Lakota warriors descending on her isolated schoolhouse sent a surge of fear through Sarah that she struggled to control. She had heard countless stories about Native American raids, tales of violence and destruction that were part of the frontier folklore shared around every fireside. But looking at Joseph, intelligent, dignified, clearly beloved by his family, she found it impossible to reconcile those stories with the reality of the people who had raised this remarkable child. "Will they hurt me?" she asked, hating the way her voice betrayed her fear. Joseph turned from the window to study her face with an intensity that reminded her powerfully of his adult dignity, despite his young years. "That depends," he said slowly, "on how they interpret what they find here. If they believe you have harmed me or taken me against my will, then yes, they will see you as an enemy to be punished. But if they understand that you saved my life—" He paused, his expression thoughtful. "My father is a wise leader who seeks peace. But even he might struggle to control his warriors' anger if they think a white woman has stolen the chiefs. Son." Sarah felt the weight of cultural misunderstanding pressing down on her like a physical burden. Everything about her situation could be misinterpreted through the lens of historical grievances and mutual distrust. A white woman alone with a Native American child, isolated from her community, with no witnesses to testify to her innocent intentions. The circumstances were perfectly designed to create exactly the kind of tragic misunderstanding that had fueled decades of conflict. "What can we do?" she asked, moving away from the window to begin pacing the length of the schoolhouse. "How can I make them understand that I only wanted to help?" Joseph considered this question with the seriousness of someone whose answer might determine both their fates. "You must show them respect," he said finally. "Not the false respect that whites usually offer when they want something, but genuine. Respect for our ways, our customs, our dignity as a people. You must let me speak first. Let me explain what happened in my own language so that there can be no misunderstanding about your actions." Sarah nodded, though the prospect of standing silently while her fate was decided in a language she couldn't understand felt almost unbearable. "What else? What other custom should I know?" "When they arrive, you must not show fear even if you feel it. Warriors respect courage and despise weakness. You must not touch your weapon." Joseph paused, scanning the room until his eyes found the small pistol Sarah kept in her desk drawer for protection against wild animals. "They will see any movement toward a gun as an act of hostility." The boy's awareness of her weapon surprised Sarah, though she realized it shouldn't have. Joseph had been observing everything about her home with the careful attention of someone trained to notice details that might prove important for survival. "Most importantly," Joseph continued, "you must understand that my father will be judging not just your actions, but your character. He will be looking for signs of the virtues our people value: honesty, courage, generosity, respect for all living things. If he sees these qualities in you, he will protect you even from his own warriors. Sarah absorbed this information while trying to prepare herself mentally for an encounter unlike anything in her previous experience. She had attended diplomatic functions in Boston, had learned the elaborate social protocols of Eastern society, but those skills seemed laughably inadequate for the situation she now faced. "Tell me about your father," she said, settling into her teaching chair while Joseph remained at the window. "Help me understand what kind of man he is." Joseph's expression softened with obvious love and respect. Red Cloud Walker is named for his ability to see clearly through the storms that confuse other men. He was a great warrior in his youth, but he learned that true strength comes from wisdom, not violence. When the white soldiers came to our lands, he fought to protect our people. But when he saw that continued fighting would only bring more death and suffering, he chose the harder path of seeking peace. The picture Joseph painted was of a leader struggling with impossible choices, trying to preserve his people's dignity and culture while navigating the overwhelming pressure of American expansion. Sarah began to understand that Red Cloud Walker faced challenges similar to her own, trying to bridge two worlds that seemed determined to misunderstand each other. "He has enemies among our own people," Joseph continued. "Warriors who believe that any cooperation with whites is betrayal. They call him weak, say that he has forgotten the warrior's path, but he knows that our children need a future that includes more than endless war." This revelation added another layer of complexity to Sarah's situation. If Red Cloud Walker was already facing criticism for his peaceful approach, finding his son in the care of a white woman could either vindicate his philosophy or provide ammunition for his enemies within the Lakota community. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself helping Joseph prepare for his people's arrival in ways that revealed the depth of cultural knowledge he carried despite his youth. He showed her how to arrange the classroom in a manner that would demonstrate respect for Lakota customs, how to present food in ways that would honor guests according to traditional protocols, and how to position herself to show deference without appearing weak or submissive. "Among our people," Joseph explained as they worked, "hospitality is sacred. Even enemies must be offered food and shelter if they come to your home. But the way you offer these things communicates volumes about your character and intentions." Sarah watched as Joseph transformed her simple schoolhouse into something that bridged both cultures, arranging her European-style furniture alongside symbolic elements that would speak to Lakota sensibilities. He showed her how to display some of her books in ways that demonstrated her commitment to learning and teaching, values that were honored in both societies. "Your father will notice these details?" Sarah asked, observing Joseph's careful attention to seemingly minor arrangements. "He notices everything," Joseph replied. "A leader who cannot read the true meaning behind people's actions does not remain a leader for long. But more than that, these arrangements will help my people understand who you really are, not who they might expect you to be, based on stories they have heard about whites." By midday, the transformation was complete, and Sarah found herself sitting in her own schoolhouse that had somehow become a space prepared for diplomatic encounter between two cultures. The familiar surroundings now carried an air of ceremony and significance that made her acutely aware of the historical importance of what was about to unfold. Joseph had returned to his position at the window, his body language shifting subtly, as his enhanced senses detected changes that remained invisible to Sarah. "They are close now," he announced, though she could still see nothing but empty prairie. Perhaps 1 mile away, moving carefully, watching for signs of danger. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate as the moment of truth approached. Everything she had learned about courage, diplomacy, and human understanding was about to be tested in circumstances where failure could mean not only her own death, but the destruction of any hope for peaceful relations between the communities. "Remember," Joseph said, turning from the window to face her directly, "my people will be judging whether you see me as a human being or as something less. They will know immediately whether your kindness comes from genuine compassion or from some other motive. There is no way to fake the sincerity they will be looking for." Sarah nodded, understanding that the next few hours would reveal truths about herself that she had never been forced to examine. The comfortable beliefs about tolerance and human dignity that had seemed so clear in the abstract were about to be tested by the reality of facing 20 armed warriors who had every reason to view her as an enemy. The silence stretched between them as they waited, each lost in thoughts about the collision of worlds that was racing toward them across the snow-covered prairie. Sarah found herself thinking about the chain of choices that had brought her to this moment, leaving Boston, becoming a frontier teacher, choosing to rescue a freezing child from a blizzard. Each decision had seemed simple at the time, driven by obvious moral imperatives that required no deep reflection. Now she understood that those apparently straightforward choices had been preparing her for this moment when her character would be revealed not through words or intentions, but through her ability to maintain her humanity in the face of fear and cultural misunderstanding. Outside, the ravens had begun to circle lower, their harsh calls echoing across the empty landscape like harbingers of change. The stillness that had marked the morning was beginning to break apart, filled with an energy that spoke of approaching horses and riders whose intentions remained shrouded in the mysteries of a culture Sarah was only beginning to understand. The test was coming, and there would be no second chances. They came like thunder made manifest, a sound that began as a distant rumble beneath the snow-muffled silence and grew into a drumbeat that seemed to shake the very foundations of the schoolhouse. Sarah felt the vibration through the floorboards before she heard it clearly, the rhythmic pounding of many horses moving at full gallop across the frozen prairie, their hoofbeats creating a percussion that spoke of power, purpose, and barely controlled urgency. Joseph straightened at the window, his young body transforming from anxious child to something that resembled a young warrior accepting his fate. "They come as I expected," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Fast and strong, but not with the wildness of a war party seeking vengeance. My father leads them. I can tell by the way they move together, disciplined, but not reckless." Sarah moved to stand beside him, and what she saw stole the breath from her lungs with its terrible beauty. Across the white expanse of prairie, a line of riders had crested the distant ridge, their dark forms silhouetted against the pale sky like figures from an ancient legend. Even at this distance, she could see the controlled power in their movement, the way they flowed across the landscape with a unity that spoke of years spent riding together in both war and peace. 23 warriors, Joseph counted, his eyes moving along the approaching line with practiced assessment. 3 scouts ranging ahead, the main body following in formation, and my father's personal guard at the center. He has brought enough men to handle any threat, but not so many as to seem like an attacking force. As the riders drew closer, details began to emerge that made Sarah's heart pound with a mixture of fear and fascination. These were not the savage raiders of frontier nightmares, but disciplined horsemen whose bearing spoke of military training and cultural pride. Their horses were magnificent animals, well-trained and clearly cherished, moving with the fluid grace that came from the deep bond between rider and mount that characterized Plains Indian culture. The warriors themselves sat their horses with an ease that seemed almost supernatural to Sarah's Eastern-educated eyes. They wore traditional winter clothing that combined practicality with ceremonial significance, decorated buckskin, fur-lined robes, and accessories that caught the weak sunlight with flashes of silver and beadwork. Several carried lances adorned with feathers, and other symbols that Joseph had taught her were marks of honor and achievement. "The man in the center," Joseph said, pointing to a figure who rode slightly ahead of the main group. "That is my father. See how the others position themselves in relation to him. They give him the respect due a war chief, but they also protect him with their formation." Sarah studied Red Cloud Walker with intense curiosity, trying to discern the character of the man whose decisions would determine her fate. Even at a distance, he commanded attention through his bearing alone, sitting his horse with the relaxed confidence of someone completely comfortable with both his mount and his authority. His hair was longer than his son's, decorated with what appeared to be eagle feathers that marked his status as a leader. Most notably, his posture conveyed neither aggression nor submission, but the alert readiness of someone prepared for any possibility. "What will happen when they arrive?" Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she had expected, despite the fear that was making her hands tremble. Joseph turned from the window to face her directly, his young features serious with the gravity of the moment. "First, they will surround the building, not as an attack, but as a precaution. My father will approach alone or with only one companion, showing that he comes in peace, but is prepared for treachery. You must go outside to meet him. Staying inside would show either fear or disrespect, both of which would work against you." The prospect of walking out to face a Lakota war chief surrounded by 23 armed warriors was almost paralyzing. But Sarah forced herself to focus on Joseph's instructions. "What should I say? How should I behave?" "Say nothing at first," Joseph advised. "Let me speak to identify myself and explain what has happened. Watch my father's face, his posture, the way he holds his hands. These will tell you how he is receiving my words, whether he believes what I am telling him." Joseph paused, his expression growing even more serious. "And remember, if he dismounts from his horse, it means he is willing to treat you as an equal worthy of respectful conversation. If he remains mounted, it means he still sees you as a potential threat." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, individual horses now distinguishable within the larger rhythm. Sarah could hear the snorting of animals breathing hard from their gallop, the jingle of metal ornaments and weapons, the low voices of men communicating in a language that sounded like music compared to the harsh consonants of English. "They are here," Joseph announced, moving toward the door with the purposeful stride of someone who had made peace with whatever was about to unfold. "Remember everything I have taught you about showing respect without showing weakness. Your life, and perhaps the future of peace between our peoples, depends on the next few minutes." Sarah followed Joseph to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force that she wondered if the approaching warriors would be able to hear it. As Joseph's hand touched the door handle, she caught his arm gently. "Whatever happens," she said, "I want you to know that these have been the most meaningful days of my life. You have taught me things about courage and dignity that I never learned in all my years of education." Joseph smiled, and for a moment the young warrior disappeared, replaced by the child she had rescued from the blizzard. "And you have shown me that not all whites are the same, that some can see us as human beings worthy of kindness. That knowledge will be important for what comes next." The door opened, and Sarah stepped into a world transformed by the presence of 23 mounted Lakota warriors arranged in a precise circle around her schoolhouse. The sight was overwhelming in its immediate impact. Magnificent horses stamping and snorting in the cold air, riders sitting with the relaxed alertness of men accustomed to danger, weapons visible but not threatening, eyes that watched every movement with the intensity of predators evaluating potential prey. but it was the man who sat his horse directly in front of the schoolhouse door who commanded Sarah's attention completely. Red Cloud Walker was younger than she had expected, perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of physical presence that spoke of strength earned through years of warfare and leadership. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but showed the intelligence and dignity that Joseph had inherited. Most importantly, his dark eyes held none of the hatred or bloodlust that frontier stories had led her to expect, but rather a careful assessment that seemed to be measuring her character with the precision of a jeweler evaluating a precious stone. Joseph stepped forward and began speaking in Lakota, his young voice carrying clearly in the still air. The language flowed like water over stones, musical and complex, carrying meaning through tonal variations that Sarah was beginning to recognize, even though she understood none of the specific words. She watched Red Cloud Walker's face as his son spoke, noting the subtle changes in expression that revealed his emotional response to what he was hearing. Relief was the first emotion she could clearly identify. The profound relief of a father discovering that his missing child was safe and unharmed. This was followed by surprise, and then what appeared to be growing interest as Joseph continued. His explanation. Several times during the recital, Red Cloud Walker's eyes moved to study Sarah directly, and she forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching, trying to project the respect and dignity that Joseph had emphasized were crucial to this encounter. When Joseph finished speaking, silence fell over the assembled warriors like a physical weight. Sarah could hear the wind moving through the bare branches of distant trees, the breathing of horses, the soft jingle of metal as riders shifted slightly in their saddles. The moment stretched endlessly while Red Cloud Walker considered what he had heard, his face revealing nothing of the decision-making process that would determine her fate. Finally, the Lakota leader spoke a single word in his own language, and Sarah's heart leaped as she saw him begin to dismount from his horse. The movement was fluid and graceful, speaking of a lifetime spent in the saddle, but its significance was what mattered most. By choosing to meet her on foot, Red Cloud Walker was acknowledging her as someone worthy of respectful conversation rather than summary judgment. Joseph moved to stand between his father and Sarah, clearly intending to serve as translator for the conversation that was about to unfold. But before he could speak, Red Cloud Walker surprised everyone by addressing Sarah directly in carefully pronounced English. "I am Red Cloud Walker," he said, his voice carrying the authority of leadership, but also an unexpected warmth. "Joseph Crow Feather tells me that you saved his life when the great storm caught him far from shelter. He says that you cared for him as if he were your own child, asking nothing in return, risking your own safety to preserve his." Sarah found her voice, though it took considerable effort to speak clearly with her heart still racing. "Your son was dying when I found him. I did what any decent person would do. I helped someone who needed help." Red Cloud Walker studied her face with an intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope. "Many of your people would not have seen a dying Lakota child as someone who deserved help," he said quietly. "Many would have turned away, or worse, yet you risked your reputation, your safety, perhaps your life, to save a boy you had never met." The accuracy of his assessment struck Sarah with unexpected force. She realized that Red Cloud Walker understood the social pressures and cultural prejudices of white society far better than she had assumed, and that he was therefore able to appreciate the full significance of her choice to help Joseph. "Your son is remarkable," Sarah replied, finding confidence in the truth of her words. "In the days we spent together, he taught me more about courage, wisdom, and dignity than I learned in years of formal education. Any risk I took was small compared to what I gained from knowing him." Red Cloud Walker translated this exchange for his warriors, and Sarah was surprised to see several of them nodding approvingly. Whatever Joseph had told them about her character was being confirmed by her words and bearing, and the atmosphere around the schoolhouse was shifting from potential hostility to something that might actually approach friendliness. "My son also tells me," Red Cloud Walker continued, "that you treated him with the respect due to a human being, not as a curiosity or a burden. He says you listened to his words as if they carried wisdom, and that you shared your own knowledge freely. This speaks well of your character." Sarah felt a flush of warmth at this praise, recognizing that she was experiencing something unprecedented in frontier relations, genuine communication between white and Lakota leaders based on mutual respect, rather than fear or misunderstanding. But even as the immediate tension began to ease, Sarah sensed that the encounter was far from over. Red Cloud Walker's careful courtesy and the disciplined attention of his warriors suggested that this meeting carried significance beyond the simple rescue of a chief's son. She was being evaluated not just as an individual, but as a representative of white society, and her performance in this moment might have implications that extended far beyond her personal safety. The test was continuing, and the most crucial moments were yet to come. Red Cloud Walker gestured toward the schoolhouse with a movement that conveyed both authority and courtesy. "May we enter your home?" he asked, the formality of his request carrying weight that Sarah was beginning to understand. "There are matters we must discuss that require privacy and time." Sarah nodded, recognizing that this invitation represented a crucial escalation in their encounter. "Of course. Please, all of you are welcome." She stepped aside to allow the Lakota leader to enter, noting how he moved with the fluid grace of someone equally comfortable in war councils and diplomatic negotiations. Red Cloud Walker spoke briefly to his warriors in Lakota, and Sarah watched with fascination as the group responded with military precision. Most of the riders dismounted and began caring for their horses, while 4 remained mounted to serve as sentries. 2 warriors followed their chief toward the schoolhouse, their presence clearly intended as protection rather than intimidation. Inside the transformed classroom, Red Cloud Walker examined the arrangements Joseph had created with obvious appreciation. His eyes moved over the carefully positioned books, the respectful display of teaching materials, and the simple but dignified preparation for guests. When his gaze settled on the chair Joseph had designated for him, positioned to show honor, without suggesting submission, he nodded with what appeared to be approval. "Your son taught me how to show proper respect for Lakota customs," Sarah explained, feeling the need to give credit where it was due. "I'm afraid my Eastern education didn't include instruction in cross-cultural diplomacy. Yet you learned quickly." "And well," Red Cloud Walker replied, settling into the offered chair with the natural dignity of someone accustomed to command. "This tells me that your willingness to show respect comes from genuine character rather than mere politeness." Joseph took his place beside his father, and Sarah noticed how the boy's posture had shifted subtly in the presence of the older man. The independence and maturity he had shown while they were alone was now tempered with the deference appropriate to a son in his father's presence, yet his dignity remained intact. The 2 warriors who had accompanied Red Cloud Walker positioned themselves near the door, their presence unobtrusive but clearly vigilant. Sarah found herself studying their faces, noting the intelligence and alertness that marked them as elite members of their leader's personal guard. "Miss Harrington," Red Cloud Walker began, using her surname with careful pronunciation, "my son has told me much about your character during these days of storm, but I would hear from your own words why you chose to risk so much for a Lakota child you had never met." The directness of the question caught Sarah slightly off guard, though she realized she should have expected it. This was clearly a man who, valued straightforward communication over diplomatic niceties. "I heard a child crying in the blizzard," she replied simply. "I couldn't live with myself if I had ignored that sound, and later learned that someone had died because I was too frightened or too prejudiced to help." Red Cloud Walker translated her response for his companions, and Sarah noticed that the warriors' expressions showed interest rather than suspicion. "And when you saw that the child was Lakota," the chief continued, "did you not think of the dangers this might bring to you?" Sarah considered the question carefully, recognizing that her answer would reveal fundamental aspects of her character and worldview. "I thought about the dangers," she admitted, "but I also thought about what kind of person I would become if I let fear of consequences prevent me from doing what I knew was right. I decided I would rather face whatever troubles came from helping Joseph than face myself in the mirror knowing I had let him die." This response prompted a longer exchange in Lakota between Red Cloud Walker and his warriors. Sarah caught Joseph's eye, and he gave her a subtle nod that suggested her words were being received favorably. "There is something you must understand about our situation," Red Cloud Walker said, his tone shifting to something more serious and confidential. "The finding of my son in your care was not the simple family matter it might appear to be. There are those among my people who believe that any contact with whites leads only to betrayal and suffering. They urged me to respond to Joseph's disappearance with immediate violence against all white settlements in the area." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You chose not to follow their advice. I chose to seek the truth before acting," Red Cloud Walker replied. "But this choice has cost me politically within my own tribe. There are warriors who now question my leadership, who say that I have become weak, too willing to trust those who have proven themselves untrustworthy." The complexity of the situation was beginning to reveal itself to Sarah in ways that went far beyond her initial understanding. Red Cloud Walker was not simply a father retrieving his son, but a leader whose political position was being tested by his decision to approach the situation with diplomacy rather than violence. "What will you tell them about what you found here?" Sarah asked, realizing that her reputation among the Lakota could have implications for the entire relationship between the two communities. Red Cloud Walker was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying Sarah's face with an intensity that felt like being weighed on some invisible scale. "That depends," he said finally, "on whether you are willing to prove that your kindness to my son represents something larger than individual compassion." "I don't understand," Sarah replied, though she sensed that she was about to be offered some kind of proposition that would change her life fundamentally. Joseph leaned forward slightly, his young face serious with the gravity of what was about to be discussed. "My father faces a great challenge," he explained. "The government agents want to move more of our people to smaller reservations, to take more of our land for white settlers. Some of our warriors want to fight, to die with honor rather than surrender our way of life. My father seeks a third path, one that preserves our people and our culture while finding ways to coexist with the whites who will continue to come west." Red Cloud Walker nodded approvingly at his son's explanation. "Joseph speaks truly. I believe that our only hope for survival lies in finding white allies who can help bridge the gap between our peoples. Leaders who understand that justice and mutual respect are possible, even necessary, if we are all to thrive in this territory." Sarah began to understand the true significance of her encounter with Joseph. She had stumbled into a moment of historical importance, where individual actions might influence the trajectory of relations between two cultures that seemed destined for continued conflict. "What are you asking of me?" she said, though part of her already suspected the answer. "I am asking you to become more than a teacher in an isolated schoolhouse," Red Cloud Walker replied. "I am asking you to become a bridge between our communities, a voice for understanding and cooperation in a time when fear and hatred seemed to be winning. The magnitude of what he was proposing struck Sarah with breathtaking force. He was asking her to abandon the safe anonymity of her current life and step into a role that would make her a target for extremists on both sides of the cultural divide. The risks would be enormous, she said, not as a refusal, but as an acknowledgement of reality. Many in the white community would see any cooperation with Lakota leaders as treason. And surely there are those among your people who would view me as a spy or manipulator. Yes, Red Cloud Walker agreed without hesitation. The risks would be enormous for both of us, but the alternative is continued conflict that will ultimately destroy my people and corrupt yours. The choice is between the danger of trying to build something better and the certainty of continued tragedy if we do nothing. Sarah looked around the schoolhouse that had been her sanctuary for 2 years, understanding that she was being asked to leave this comfortable isolation and enter a world of political complexity and personal danger that would test every principle. She claimed to hold dear. What would this alliance involve, she asked, recognizing that she was already leaning toward acceptance despite the risks. Red Cloud Walker exchanged glances with his son before responding. There is to be a great council in the spring, when the grass grows green again. Representatives from many tribes will gather to discuss our response to the government's new policies. I want you to be there, to speak for the possibility of peaceful coexistence, to help my people understand that not all whites are our enemies. The request was staggering in its implications. Sarah would be the first white woman to address a gathering of Lakota leaders, speaking on behalf of peace and understanding, in a setting where many participants would view her very presence as an insult. And in return, she asked, sensing that Red Cloud Walker had specific expectations about what she would gain from such an arrangement. In return, you would have the protection and respect of my people. You would become part of our extended family, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails, and you would help us develop educational programs that prepare our children for the world they will inherit, a world that will require them to understand both Lakota and white cultures. Joseph spoke for the first time since his father had begun outlining his proposal. Sarah, he said, using her first name for the first time, you have already shown that you can teach with respect for different ways of understanding the world. Our children need teachers who can help them preserve their Lakota identity while gaining the skills they will need to survive in a changing world. Sarah realized that she was being offered something unprecedented, the opportunity to create a genuinely bicultural educational system that honored both traditions while preparing children for an uncertain future. It was the kind of meaningful work she had dreamed of but never believed possible. But the personal cost would be enormous. Accepting Red Cloud Walker's proposal would mean abandoning her comfortable relationship with white society, risking her safety in ways she could barely imagine, and accepting responsibility for outcomes that could affect thousands of lives. I need time to consider this, she said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew that her decision was already made. The woman who had rushed into a blizzard to save a freezing child could not walk away from an opportunity to save 2 entire communities from the tragedy of perpetual conflict. Red Cloud Walker nodded with understanding. The Spring Council is still many months away. Use that time to prepare yourself for what will be asked of you. And remember, once you commit to this path, there will be no retreat to the safety of neutrality. As if summoned by some invisible signal, the warriors outside began preparing for departure. Sarah understood that the formal portion of the meeting had concluded, but that the real work of building trust and understanding was just beginning. The choice before her was clear and terrifying and absolutely necessary. The 3 weeks that followed Red Cloud Walker's departure passed like a fever dream of anticipation and dread. Sarah found herself caught between two worlds that were both familiar and suddenly foreign. Her daily routine in Cedar Rapids had remained unchanged, yet everything felt different through the lens of the choice that awaited her decision. Each morning brought the same children to her classroom, the same lessons to teach, the same conversations with neighbors and community leaders. But beneath the surface of this comfortable normalcy, Sarah was preparing for a transformation that would either elevate her to historical significance or destroy everything she had built in Dakota territory. The first sign that word of her encounter with the Lakota had spread came during a routine school board meeting 3 days after the warriors' departure. Mayor Patterson, normally a man of direct speech and practical concerns, seemed unusually hesitant as he broached the subject that was clearly on everyone's mind. "Sarah," he began, avoiding her eyes as he spoke, "there have been some questions raised about your activities during the recent storm. Some concerns about whether you might have had contact with hostile Indians while you were isolated at the schoolhouse." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with apprehension, though she had been expecting this moment. "What kind of concerns, James?" she asked, keeping her voice level despite the racing of her heart. Dr. Morrison, who had always been one of her strongest supporters, leaned forward with obvious discomfort. "Sarah, you know we all respect your work here, your dedication to the children and the community, but there are rumors circulating that suggest you may have provided aid to Lakota warriors during the blizzard. People are asking questions about your loyalty, your judgment. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire, acrid and impossible to ignore." Sarah realized that she was facing the first test of the choice Red Cloud Walker had offered her. She could deny the encounter, maintain her comfortable position in white society, and preserve the illusion of neutrality that had protected her for 2 years. Or she could tell the truth and accept the consequences of having crossed the invisible line that separated acceptable behavior from suspected treachery. "I helped a child who was dying in the snow," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "He was Lakota, yes, but he was also a 10-year-old boy who would have frozen to death if I had turned away from his cries for help." The silence that followed her words was profound and telling. Mrs. Patterson, who had always treated Sarah with maternal kindness, looked shocked and disappointed. Frank Morrison, the mayor's deputy, actually pushed his chair back from the table as if Sarah had suddenly become dangerous. "Sarah," Mayor Patterson said heavily, "you must understand how this looks to the community. We're living in dangerous times, with tensions running high between the settlers and the tribes. Any indication that you've been sympathetic to the Indians could be interpreted as collaboration, even treason." The word treason struck Sarah like a physical blow, though she had known it would eventually be spoken. In the frontier mindset that governed Dakota territory, any assistance provided to Native Americans was viewed through the lens of an ongoing war, where neutrality was considered impossible and compassion was seen as weakness. "I understand how it looks," Sarah replied, feeling the weight of her decision settling around her like a mantle of responsibility. "But I also understand that my choice was between saving a child's life and preserving my social standing. I chose to save the child, and I would make the same choice again." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Sarah, there's something else you need to know. Word of this incident has reached the territorial authorities. There may be an official investigation into your actions, questions about whether you've been compromised by Indian influence." The threat of government investigation added a new dimension of danger to Sarah's situation. Territorial authorities had broad powers to deal with suspected collaborators, and their definition of collaboration was notoriously elastic when it came to any cooperation with Native American communities. "What are my options?" Sarah asked. Though she suspected she already knew the answer, Mayor Patterson's expression was genuinely pained as he delivered what amounted to an ultimatum. You could make a public statement denouncing any sympathy for the Indian cause, emphasizing your loyalty to white civilization and your regret for any misunderstanding your actions may have caused. The territorial authorities might accept such a statement as sufficient proof of your reliability. Sarah felt a bitter laugh rising in her throat. The suggestion that she publicly denounce her decision to save Joseph's life was so morally repugnant that she could barely comprehend how good people could suggest it as a reasonable solution. "And if I refuse to make such a statement?" she asked, already knowing but needing to hear the consequences spoken aloud. "Then your position here becomes untenable," Dr. Morrison said sadly. "The community will no longer trust you with their children's education. The territorial authorities will view you as a security risk. You'll be forced to leave Dakota Territory entirely, probably under circumstances that would make it impossible for you to find teaching work anywhere in the Western Territories." The choice was being presented in stark terms that allowed no middle ground: repudiate her principles and maintain her comfortable life, or stand by her convictions and face exile from the only home she had known since leaving Boston. It was exactly the kind of test that Red Cloud Walker had warned her about, the moment when comfortable neutrality would no longer be possible. "I need time to consider this," Sarah said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew that her decision had been made the moment she opened her door to rescue a freezing child from the blizzard. The meeting ended with awkward formalities and promises to reconvene after Sarah had time to think clearly about her priorities. As the board members filed out of the schoolhouse, Sarah caught Mayor Patterson's arm gently. "James," she said, "I want you to know that I understand the position this puts you in. You've been a good friend and supporter, and I don't want my choices to create problems for you or your family." Patterson's weathered face showed genuine regret. "Sarah, you're one of the finest teachers this territory has ever seen, and a better person than most of us deserve. But the times we're living in don't allow for the kind of moral luxury your choice represents. Sometimes good people have to make compromises to survive." After he left, Sarah found herself alone in the schoolhouse that had been her refuge and workplace for 2 years, understanding that she was seeing it with new eyes, not as a permanent home, but as a chapter in her life that was rapidly drawing to a close. The familiar objects that had surrounded her daily existence suddenly seemed like artifacts from someone else's life, reminders of a time when her choices had been simpler and their consequences more predictable. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor who would accelerate Sarah's timeline for decision-making. Margaret Whitman arrived at the schoolhouse in a state of agitation that immediately put Sarah on alert. Margaret was the wife of the territorial Indian agent, a woman whose husband's position gave her access to information about government policies and official attitudes toward Native American relations. "Sarah," Margaret said, barely waiting for the door to close behind her, "I had to come warn you about what's happening. My husband received orders yesterday that directly concern you and your situation." Sarah felt her heart sink as she gestured for Margaret to sit down. "What kind of orders?" "There's to be a formal investigation into your contact with the Lakota. But more than that, the territorial governor has decided to make an example of anyone suspected of Indian sympathies. They're planning to use your case to demonstrate that collaboration with hostile tribes will not be tolerated." The news was worse than Sarah had expected, suggesting that her private moral choice was about to become a public political spectacle designed to send a message to other potential sympathizers. "How much time do I have?" Sarah asked, recognizing that she was now operating under a deadline that would force immediate action. "Perhaps a week, maybe 2 at most," Margaret replied. "My husband is supposed to conduct the preliminary investigation, but he's been ordered to expedite the process." "Sarah, you need to understand. They don't want to find you innocent. They want to find you guilty as a warning to others. The political machinery that would destroy her was already in motion, driven by forces that had nothing to do with justice or her actual actions. Sarah was being sacrificed to serve a larger agenda of intimidation and control that characterized the territorial government's approach to Native American relations. "There's something else," Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a whisper despite their privacy. "There are rumors that some of the more radical settlers are planning to take matters into their own hands if the official investigation doesn't produce the results they want. Sarah, I'm afraid for your safety. The threat of vigilante violence added physical danger to the legal and social consequences Sarah was already facing. She was beginning to understand that her choice was not just between comfort and principle, but between survival within white society and potential martyrdom for a cause that transcended individual safety. That evening, as Sarah sat in her classroom, preparing lessons for students she might never again have the opportunity to teach, she found herself thinking about the conversation she had had with Joseph about the burden of preserving knowledge in times of cultural destruction. She was facing her own version of that challenge, how to preserve her commitment to human dignity and cross-cultural understanding in a society that was determined to punish such values. The irony was not lost on her that the same community that had once praised her independence and moral courage was now threatening to destroy her for exercising those exact qualities in a situation that challenged their prejudices. She was learning that moral consistency often required sacrifices that fair-weather supporters were unwilling to make. A knock at the door interrupted her brooding, and Sarah opened it to find young Timothy Patterson standing on her threshold, his face serious with the gravity of his message. "Miss Harrington," he said, "my pa sent me to tell you that there's a meeting tomorrow night at the church. All the adults are supposed to come to discuss the Indian situation and what should be done about it." Sarah understood immediately that this meeting would be the community's formal judgment of her actions, the moment when Cedar Rapids would decide whether she remained acceptable as their teacher or became an enemy requiring expulsion. "Thank you for telling me, Timothy," she said gently. "I'll be there." As she watched the boy disappear into the gathering dusk, Sarah realized that the time for careful consideration and gradual decision-making had passed. Tomorrow night would force her to declare her allegiance publicly, to choose between the safety of conformity and the danger of standing for principles that her community was no longer willing to tolerate. The test was upon her, and there would be no more delays. The Methodist Church of Cedar Rapids had never hosted a gathering quite like the one that assembled on that frigid February evening. Every adult in the settlement seemed to be present, crowding into pews that normally accommodated the Sunday faithful in comfortable separation. But tonight, the usual social hierarchies had dissolved into something more primitive, a community tribunal that would determine the fate of one of its own members through the ancient process of collective judgment. Sarah arrived precisely as the church bell finished tolling 7 o'clock, her decision to appear punctually reflecting both respect for the proceedings and refusal to show the fear that was gnawing at her composure. She had dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing her most conservative teaching dress and arranging her hair in the severe style that commanded respect in professional settings. If she was to be judged, she would face that judgment with the dignity befitting someone who had spent her life dedicated to education and moral principle. The moment she stepped through the church doors, Sarah felt the weight of collective attention, focusing on her like sunlight concentrated through a magnifying glass. Conversations died mid-sentence, leaving behind a silence that hummed with tension and barely suppressed emotion. Eyes followed her movement down the center aisle, some showing sympathy, others displaying the kind of cold assessment that marked her as a problem requiring solution. Reverend Michael Carson stood at the front of the church, his usually warm demeanor replaced by the stern authority of someone presiding over a matter of community survival. Behind him, arranged in chairs that suggested an informal tribunal, sat the settlement's most influential men. Mayor Patterson, Dr. Morrison, Frank Whitman, the territorial agent, and Robert Sterling, the successful rancher whose opinions carried weight throughout the territory. "Miss Harrington," Reverend Carson began, his voice carrying clearly in the packed church, "thank you for joining us tonight. We've called this gathering to address concerns that have arisen regarding your recent actions and their implications for our community's safety and welfare." Sarah remained standing in the center aisle, understanding instinctively that taking a seat would suggest submission to judgment rather than participation in discussion. "Reverend Carson," she replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart, "I'm here to answer any questions about my conduct, though I must say I'm surprised that helping a dying child has become a matter requiring community investigation." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd at her directness, some voices showing approval for her courage, while others expressed disapproval of what they interpreted as defiance of legitimate authority. Mayor Patterson rose from his chair, his expression showing the strain of a man caught between personal affection and political necessity. "Sarah, no one questions your good intentions. But intentions aren't the only consideration when community safety is at stake. Your decision to harbor a Lakota child, regardless of the circumstances, has created a situation that threatens our peaceful relations with the territorial authorities." Sarah felt a flash of anger at the euphemistic language that transformed her rescue of Joseph into harboring a threat. "James, I didn't harbor anyone. I saved a child who was dying in a blizzard. If that action threatens our relations with any authority, then perhaps we need to examine what kind of authority we're dealing with." Frank Whitman stood abruptly, his face flushed with the kind of righteous indignation that Sarah had learned to associate with men whose power derived from their willingness to enforce unpopular policies. "Miss Harrington, your attitude demonstrates exactly the kind of naive idealism that makes you unsuitable for residence in a frontier community. You seem to think that moral gestures exist in isolation from political realities." "Mr. Whitman," Sarah replied, turning to face the territorial agent directly, "I think that moral principles are meaningless if we abandon them whenever they become politically inconvenient. The political reality you're referring to is the systematic dehumanization of Native American peoples, and I refuse to participate in that process." The boldness of her statement sent a shock through the assembled crowd. Sarah had not simply defended her actions, she had challenged the fundamental assumptions that governed frontier attitudes toward Native Americans, forcing everyone present to confront the moral implications of policies they had accepted without question. Dr. Morrison rose with obvious reluctance, his medical training apparently warring with his social obligations. "Sarah, surely you can see that your position is untenable. Even if we accept that your motives were pure, the consequences of your actions extend far beyond your individual choices. There are families in this community whose safety may be compromised by any suggestion that Cedar Rapids tolerates Indian sympathizers." The doctor's words revealed the core of the community's fears, not simply disapproval of Sarah's actions, but terror that association with her would bring down governmental retaliation on the entire settlement. She was not just being judged as an individual, but being sacrificed to protect the collective security of people who had once considered her a valued community member. "Dr. Morrison," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhetorical footing, "you've treated injured children for years without asking about their parents' political beliefs or racial background. You've made life and death decisions based on medical need rather than social convenience. How is my choice to save Joseph Crow Feather any different from the choices you make in your practice every day? The comparison struck home with devastating effectiveness, forcing the doctor to confront the inconsistency between his professional ethics and his social judgments. His silence was more damning than any verbal response could have been. Robert Sterling, who had remained quiet during the previous exchanges, now stood with the ponderous authority of someone accustomed to having his words carry decisive weight. Miss Harrington, you're asking us to risk everything we've built here for the sake of abstract moral principles. These are good people, hard-working families who came west to build better lives for their children. Are you prepared to see their dreams destroyed because you couldn't turn away from one Indian child? The question was designed to isolate Sarah morally, to make her appear selfish and irresponsible for placing principle above practical considerations. But it also revealed the fundamental cowardice that underlay much of frontier hostility toward Native Americans, fear that justice might require sacrifice from those who had benefited from injustice. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the authority she had developed through years of classroom management, "you're asking me to believe that this community's prosperity depends on our willingness to let children die in snowstorms because they happen to be Lakota. If that's true, then we've built something that doesn't deserve to survive." The stark moral challenge of her words created a moment of profound silence in the packed church. Sarah had forced the community to confront the logical endpoint of their position, that their safety and prosperity required them to abandon basic human decency when it conflicted with political expediency. Reverend Carson attempted to regain control of the proceedings, but the momentum had shifted decisively. "Miss Harrington, surely you can see that there must be some middle ground. Some way to acknowledge your good intentions while also recognizing the practical necessities of frontier life." "Reverend," Sarah replied, her teacher's instincts kicking. As she recognized a teachable moment, "I've spent 2 years in this community learning about frontier necessities. I've seen families work together to survive droughts, blizzards, crop failures, and economic hardships. I've watched neighbors sacrifice for each other without question when survival was at stake. The only thing I haven't seen is any evidence that our survival requires us to become morally bankrupt." From the back of the church, an unexpected voice interrupted the formal proceedings. "She's right, and you all know it." The speaker was Martha Lindquist, the Swedish immigrant whose daughter Emma was one of Sarah's most promising students. "My family came here with nothing, and this community helped us survive our first winter. Miss Harrington helped my Emma learn English, helped her feel proud of her heritage while becoming American. Now you want to destroy her because she showed the same kindness to an Indian child that you showed to us." Martha's intervention created a ripple of supporting voices from other immigrant families who had benefited from Sarah's inclusive approach to education. The Kowalski family, whose sons struggled with reading difficulties until Sarah developed special techniques to help him succeed. The O'Brien clan, whose children had been behind in mathematics until Sarah created innovative methods that built on their practical farm experience. For a moment it seemed as though Sarah might have enough community support to weather the political storm. But Frank Whitman quickly moved to reassert governmental authority. "This is very touching," he said with barely concealed contempt, "but it's also irrelevant. The territorial government has made its position clear regarding Indian sympathizers. Miss Harrington can either publicly renounce her actions and pledge loyalty to white civilization, or she can face the legal consequences of her choices." The ultimatum was delivered with the finality of someone accustomed to having his authority accepted without question. But Sarah had passed beyond the point where governmental threats could intimidate her into moral compromise. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice carrying across the silent church with crystalline clarity, "I will not renounce my decision to save a child's life. I will not pledge loyalty to any civilization that requires me to deny my basic humanity. And I will not participate in a system that treats human decency as a form of treason. The declaration was met with a moment of stunned silence, followed by an eruption of voices as the community began to fracture along lines that had been hidden beneath the surface of frontier solidarity. Some voices showed approval for Sarah's courage, while others expressed outrage at her defiance of legitimate authority. The careful unity that had characterized Cedar Rapids was dissolving before their eyes, replaced by the kind of bitter division that could destroy communities as effectively as any external threat. Mayor Patterson stood and raised his hand for silence, his face showing the strain of a leader trying to hold together a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. We need to bring this meeting to some kind of resolution, he said heavily. Miss Harrington has made her position clear. The question now is how this community responds to that position. Sarah understood that the moment of final judgment had arrived. The community that had welcomed her 2 years earlier was about to decide whether her moral courage made her a hero worthy of protection or a threat requiring elimination. Either way, her comfortable life as the respected schoolteacher of Cedar Rapids was ending, replaced by something far more dangerous and far more meaningful. The vote, when it came, would determine not just her individual fate, but the moral character of an entire frontier community facing the choice between expedient cowardice and principled courage. The vote that would have determined Sarah's fate never came. As Mayor Patterson prepared to call for a formal decision on her status in the community, the church doors burst open with a force that sent them crashing against the interior walls. A blast of frigid air swept through the packed building, carrying with it the sound of multiple horses and the unmistakable presence of riders who had arrived with urgent purpose. Every head in the church turned toward the disturbance. And what? The congregation saw defied every expectation they had harbored about this evening's proceedings. Joseph Crow Feather stood in the doorway, no longer the half-frozen child Sarah had rescued, but a young Lakota warrior dressed in full ceremonial regalia that spoke of honor and high standing within his tribe. Behind him, filling the doorway, and extending beyond it into the night, stood Red Cloud Walker and 12 of his most trusted warriors. The sight of armed Lakota warriors entering their church sent a shock of pure terror through the assembled settlers. Women gasped and clutched their children. Men reached instinctively for weapons that weren't there, and the careful order of the community meeting dissolved into barely controlled panic. Only Sarah remained calm, recognizing in Joseph's bearing and his father's presence not a threat, but the answer to a dilemma she hadn't known how to resolve. "People of Cedar Rapids," Red Cloud Walker announced, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence that had replaced the earlier chaos. "I come before you not as an enemy, but as a father who owes a debt that can never be fully repaid." The Lakota chief moved with the same fluid grace Sarah remembered, but now that grace was displayed before an audience that had never seen Native American dignity presented without apology or submission. His ceremonial clothing was magnificent, intricately beaded buckskin decorated with symbols that spoke of military honors and spiritual authority, eagle feathers that marked his status as a war leader, and accessories that caught the lamplight. With flashes of silver and turquoise, Frank Whitman struggled to his feet, his face alternating between terror and outrage as he tried to process this unprecedented violation of every protocol that governed white-Indian relations. "This is an illegal assembly," he stammered, his voice cracking with stress. "Armed Indians have no right to enter a Christian church. I demand that you leave immediately." Red Cloud Walker turned his attention to the territorial agent with the kind of measured assessment that a predator might give potential prey. "Mr. Whitman," he said, pronouncing the name with careful precision. "I know who you are, just as I know the policies you represent. But tonight I am not here as a subject of your authority. I am here as a father protecting someone who has become a part of my family." The declaration sent another shock through the assembled settlers, who were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in frontier history. A Lakota chief claiming kinship with a white woman, and backing that claim with the presence of armed warriors. Joseph stepped forward, his young voice carrying with adult authority as he addressed the community that had been sitting in judgment of his savior. "People of Cedar Rapids, you have spent this evening questioning the character of Miss Sarah Harrington. You have suggested that her kindness to me was somehow a betrayal of your community. I am here to tell you what kind of woman you have been judging." The boy's English was flawless, his bearing dignified, and his presence in full Lakota regalia created a powerful visual reminder that the Indian child, some of them had been willing to let die, was a human being of intelligence, culture, and inherent worth. "When she found me dying in the snow," Joseph continued, "Miss Harrington did not ask about my race or my tribe. She did not calculate the political consequences of helping me. She saw a child who needed saving, and she risked her own safety to preserve my life. For 3 days, she cared for me, as if I were her own son, treating me with respect and kindness that many of my own teachers at the white school never showed." Dr. Morrison, who had been struggling with his own conscience throughout the evening, found his voice. "Young man, no one questions Miss Harrington's good intentions, but surely you can understand that her actions have created complications that extend beyond individual kindness." Red Cloud Walker stepped forward, his presence commanding attention through sheer force of personality. "Dr. Morrison, you speak of complications as if they were more important than human life. Let me tell you about complications. For generations, my people have watched as white settlers claimed our ancestral lands, killed our buffalo, and destroyed our way of life. We have seen our children taken from us and forced into schools designed to make them ashamed of their heritage." The chief's words carried a weight of historical grievance that filled the church with uncomfortable awareness of the broader context surrounding their local crisis. These were not abstract policy discussions, but the lived experiences of people who had suffered systematic dispossession and cultural destruction. "But tonight," Red Cloud Walker continued, "I stand before you not to recite old grievances, but to acknowledge that among your people there are individuals worthy of respect and alliance. Miss Sarah Harrington has proven herself to be such a person, and I claim her as a sister under Lakota law." The formal adoption declaration sent a murmur of shock through the assembled settlers. Lakota adoption was not merely ceremonial, but carried legal and cultural obligations that would make Sarah a permanent member of the tribe, with all the rights and protections that entailed. Mayor Patterson, struggling to maintain some semblance of control over the rapidly evolving situation, attempted to reassert local authority. "Chief Red Cloud Walker, while we appreciate your gratitude toward Miss Harrington, you must understand that she is a citizen of this territory, subject to its laws and obligations." "And you must understand," Red Cloud Walker replied with quiet authority, "that she is now also a member of the Lakota Nation, subject to our laws and entitled to our protection. Any action taken against her will be considered an action taken against my people." The threat was delivered without bluster or aggression, but its implications were clear to everyone present. The territorial authorities could no longer move against Sarah without risking a broader conflict with the Lakota that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. Joseph moved to stand beside Sarah, his ceremonial dress creating a powerful visual statement about the alliance that was forming before the community's eyes. "Miss Harrington," he said formally, "my father offers you a choice that no white person in this territory has ever been offered. You can remain here, trying to satisfy people who will never forgive you for treating a Lakota child as a human being. Or you can come with us to help build the kind of educational system that prepares children of both races for a future that includes understanding instead of hatred. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling around her like destiny, made manifest. Everything she had dreamed of during her years of teaching, meaningful work that transcended cultural boundaries, the opportunity to create something genuinely valuable, a chance to live according to her deepest principles, was being offered to her by people who had every reason to distrust white motives. But accepting their offer would mean abandoning not only her comfortable life in Cedar Rapids, but any hope of reconciliation with white society. She would be crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, allying herself permanently with people that her own culture considered enemies. Frank Whitman, recognizing that the situation was slipping beyond governmental control, made one final attempt to reassert territorial authority. Miss Harrington, if you leave with these Indians, you will be considered a renegade and a traitor. There will be no protection for you under territorial law, no possibility of return to civilized society. Sarah looked around the church at the faces of people who had once welcomed her as a valued community member, but were now ready to sacrifice her to protect their own comfort and security. Then she looked at Red Cloud Walker and Joseph, who were offering her something far more precious than safety, the opportunity to live with integrity and purpose. "Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "I've spent this evening listening to supposedly civilized people discuss whether saving a child's life constitutes treason. If that's what passes for civilization in this territory, then I choose what you call savagery." Sarah moved to stand between Red Cloud Walker and Joseph, her symbolic positioning creating a visual representation of the alliance that was forming. "I accept your offer," she said to the Lakota chief. "I choose to stand with people who value human life over political convenience." The declaration created an uproar in the church as the full implications of what was happening became clear to everyone present. Sarah Harrington, respected teacher and pillar of the community, was openly defecting to the Lakota, taking with her knowledge of white society that could prove invaluable to tribal strategic planning. But even as voices rose, in anger and accusations of treason filled the air, other voices began to make themselves heard. Martha Lindquist stood again, her Swedish accent thick with emotion, as she addressed the Lakota chief directly. "Chief Red Cloud Walker," she said, her courage remarkable given the explosive tensions in the room. "My family came to this territory as strangers, and Miss Harrington helped us find our place here. If she believes that your people offer a better future for education and understanding, then perhaps others should listen to what you have to say." Her words created a moment of stunned silence, followed by the sound of other immigrant families expressing similar sentiments. The community that had seemed united in its suspicion of Sarah's choices was revealing itself to be more divided than anyone had realized. Red Cloud Walker studied the faces of these unexpected supporters with obvious interest. "People of Cedar Rapids," he said, "I did not come here tonight to recruit followers or to create division in your community. I came to honor a debt and to offer protection to someone who deserves it. But I will say this. The future of this territory will be determined by whether people choose fear or understanding, hatred or cooperation." As the Lakota warriors prepared to escort Sarah from the church, she took one final look at the community that had been her home for 2 years. Some faces showed anger and betrayal, others reflected confusion and uncertainty, but a surprising number displayed something that might have been envy, the recognition that she was choosing a path of principled action that they lacked the courage to follow themselves. The alliance had been formed, and there would be no going back. The Lakota encampment that Sarah entered 3 days later bore no resemblance to the savage wilderness settlements described in frontier newspapers and government reports. What she found instead was a sophisticated community that had adapted traditional ways of life to the realities of reservation existence while maintaining the cultural integrity that defined Lakota identity. The careful arrangement of lodges, the organized systems for food distribution and communal work, and the evident prosperity, despite government restrictions, revealed a people whose intelligence and resilience had been consistently underestimated by white authorities. Sarah's formal adoption ceremony took place on her first evening in the camp, conducted according to ancient protocols that Red Cloud Walker modified to accommodate the unprecedented nature of inducting a white woman into full tribal membership. The ritual was both deeply spiritual and intensely practical, establishing not only Sarah's ceremonial status, but her actual role and responsibilities within the community structure that would govern her new life. "Wakin Yellow Waist, Red Cloud," Walker announced as he placed the traditional ceremonial shawl around Sarah's shoulders. "Good Thunder Woman, this is your Lakota name, chosen because you came to us during the Great Storm and brought the thunder of change that will shake both our worlds." The name carried weight beyond its poetic imagery, Sarah learned as the ceremony progressed. In Lakota culture, names were not merely identifiers, but prophecies and responsibilities, defining the role an individual was expected to play in the larger story of the people. By naming her Good Thunder Woman, the tribe was acknowledging her potential to create the kind of transformative change that could alter the trajectory of white-Indian relations throughout the territory. Singing Dove, Joseph's mother, and Red Cloud Walker's wife, stepped forward to present Sarah with the clothing and accessories that would mark her new status. The beaded dress she received had been crafted specifically for this moment, its patterns telling the story of her rescue of Joseph and her acceptance into the family. Each design element carried symbolic meaning that connected her personal story to the larger narrative of Lakota survival and adaptation. "Sister," Singing Dove said, using the kinship term that formalized Sarah's relationship to the chief's family, "these garments carry the prayers of all the women who worked to create them. They represent our hope that you will help us find a path that preserves our children's future while honoring our ancestors' wisdom." As Sarah donned her new identity, she became aware of the complex dynamics within the Lakota community that paralleled the division she had left behind in Cedar Rapids. Not all tribal members were enthusiastic about Red Cloud Walker's strategy of seeking cooperation with sympathetic whites. A significant faction, led by War Chief Thunderhorse, viewed any accommodation with white society as ultimately futile and potentially dangerous. Thunderhorse himself approached Sarah during the feast that followed her adoption ceremony, his bearing conveying both respect for the chief's decision and skepticism about its wisdom. He was a man in his early 30s, bearing the scars of previous conflicts with white soldiers and possessing the kind of charismatic intensity that made him a natural leader of those who favored more aggressive resistance to white encroachment. "Good Thunder Woman," he said, using her new name with careful formality, "Red Cloud Walker believes that you represent a new possibility for peace between our peoples. I hope he is correct, but I have seen too many promises broken, too many treaties violated to share his optimism easily." Sarah understood that Thunderhorse was not merely expressing personal skepticism, but representing a substantial portion of the tribe whose support would be crucial for any peaceful initiative to succeed. "I understand your doubts," she replied, "and I don't expect trust to be given freely. I hope to earn it through my actions rather than my words." Thunderhorse studied her face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read character as a survival skill. "Actions," he agreed. We will see what your actions reveal about your true loyalties when you face the tests that are coming. The seed tests Thunder Horse referred to became clear over the following weeks as Sarah began her work establishing the educational program that would serve as the practical foundation for Red Cloud Walker's vision of cultural bridge building. The challenges were enormous, requiring her to develop teaching methods that honored Lakota values while preparing children for successful interaction with white society. The existing government school system, which Joseph had fled, was designed to destroy Native American identity through forced assimilation. Students were punished for speaking their native language, forbidden to practice traditional customs, and taught to be ashamed of their heritage. Sarah's alternative approach required her to create something entirely new, an educational system that strengthened cultural identity while expanding practical opportunities. Working with a group of Lakota elders who had been designated as her cultural advisors, Sarah began developing curriculum that integrated traditional knowledge with conventional academic subjects. Mathematics lessons incorporated the geometric principles underlying traditional beadwork and lodge construction. History classes examined Lakota oral traditions alongside written records of white expansion, allowing students to understand their place in the larger story of American development. Most importantly, language instruction became a bridge rather than a weapon of cultural destruction. Students learned English as a valuable skill that would help them navigate white society, while their Lakota language studies were enhanced and celebrated as the foundation of their cultural identity. The response from the children themselves exceeded Sarah's most optimistic expectations. Released from the psychological warfare of forced assimilation, they displayed the natural curiosity and intelligence that had been suppressed by the government's educational approach. Joseph emerged as a natural leader among his peers, his bicultural fluency making him an invaluable assistant in Sarah's teaching efforts. "Miss Sarah," Joseph said during one of their planning sessions, "the children are asking if they can invite their families to see what they're learning. They want to show their grandparents that education doesn't have to mean forgetting who they are." The family education sessions that resulted from this request became one of the most powerful aspects of Sarah's program. Parents and elders who had been suspicious of formal education began to see its potential when presented in ways that honored rather than threatened their cultural values. Grandmothers shared traditional stories that Sarah helped students analyze for their mathematical and scientific principles. Grandfathers demonstrated hunting and tracking skills that students then documented using writing techniques learned in English classes. Word of these innovations began to spread beyond the immediate community, attracting attention from government officials who viewed any deviation from standard assimilation practices as potentially subversive. Frank Whitman, the territorial agent whose authority Sarah had rejected in Cedar Rapids, arrived at the encampment 6 weeks after her adoption with an escort of federal marshals and a mandate to investigate irregular educational activities. Among the Lakota, the confrontation that followed would test everything Sarah had learned about navigating the complex political landscape that governed white Indian relations in Dakota Territory. Whitman's arrival represented not just personal animosity toward Sarah, but the federal government's determination to suppress any educational approach that might strengthen rather than weaken Native American cultural identity. "Miss Harrington," Whitman announced upon his arrival, deliberately using her white name to deny the legitimacy of her Lakota adoption. "You are in violation of federal regulations governing education on Indian reservations. I'm here to shut down your unauthorized school and escort you to territorial headquarters for questioning." Red Cloud Walker stepped forward with the quiet authority that had made him a successful negotiator in previous conflicts with government officials. "Agent Whitman, the woman you are addressing is Good Thunder Woman, a full member of the Lakota Nation under the terms of the Treaty of Fort Laramie. She is conducting educational activities at the request of the Tribal Council and under the protection of tribal sovereignty. The legal complexities of Sarah's situation created exactly the kind of jurisdictional uncertainty that territorial officials found most frustrating. As a white woman, she could be subject to federal authority, but as an adopted Lakota, she fell under tribal jurisdiction that the government was theoretically bound to respect under existing treaty obligations. Whitman's response revealed the government's willingness to ignore treaty obligations when they proved inconvenient. Tribal sovereignty doesn't extend to harboring white renegades who are conducting subversive activities. Miss Harrington will be taken into federal custody immediately. The federal marshals who had accompanied Whitman moved forward to arrest Sarah, but found their path blocked by a circle of Lakota warriors who had materialized around the confrontation with silent efficiency. Thunderhorse stood at their head, his hand resting casually on his weapon in a gesture that conveyed readiness without constituting an overt threat. "Agent Whitman," Thunderhorse said with deceptive calm, "Good Thunder Woman is under the protection of the Lakota Nation. Any attempt to remove her against her will would be considered an act of war against our people." The standoff that followed crystallized all the tensions that had been building around Sarah's presence in the community. Whitman faced the choice between backing down from his mission or precipitating a violent confrontation that could escalate into broader conflict between the Lakota and federal authorities. Sarah realized that this moment would determine not only her own fate, but the future of the educational experiment she had begun and the larger vision of peaceful coexistence that Red Cloud Walker was trying to achieve. The decision about how to respond lay with her, and whatever choice she made would have consequences that extended far beyond her personal safety. "Agent Whitman," she said, stepping forward into the space between the opposing forces, "I am exactly where I choose to be, doing work that serves both Lakota and American interests. The children I'm teaching are learning skills that will make them productive citizens while maintaining pride in their heritage. If the federal government considers that subversive, then perhaps the government needs to examine its own assumptions about what constitutes proper education." Whitman's face flushed with anger and frustration. "Miss Harrington, you are either a loyal American citizen subject to federal authority, or you are an enemy of the United States government. There is no middle ground in this matter." Sarah looked around the circle of faces, Lakota warriors prepared to fight for her protection, children whose educational future hung in the balance, and government officials whose narrow vision threatened to destroy everything she had worked to build. "Agent Whitman," she replied with the conviction that had carried her through every crisis of her transformation, "you're wrong about there being no middle ground. I'm standing on that middle ground right now, and I intend to defend it." The challenge had been issued, and the response would determine whether Sarah's vision of cultural bridge building could survive its first real test against the forces that profited from maintaining division and hatred between the peoples of Dakota Territory. The standoff that began with Agent Whitman's arrival stretched through 3 tense days that would reshape the political landscape of Dakota Territory in ways none of the participants could have anticipated. What started as a simple attempt to arrest a renegade schoolteacher evolved into a complex negotiation involving federal authorities, tribal leaders, and an unexpected coalition of supporters whose voices would prove decisive in determining the outcome. The breakthrough came from an entirely unexpected source. On the morning of the 3rd day, as federal marshals maintained their uneasy perimeter around the Lakota encampment, a delegation of white settlers arrived under a flag of truce. Leading them was Martha Lindquist, the Swedish immigrant who had spoken in Sarah's defense during the church meeting in Cedar Rapids, accompanied by representatives from several other immigrant families whose children had benefited from Sarah's inclusive educational approach. "Agent Whitman," Martha announced with the confidence of someone who had made peace with the consequences of her courage, "we represent 43 families from settlements throughout this territory. We've come to request a formal hearing regarding Miss Harrington's educational methods and their potential benefits for all children in the region." Whitman's face showed incredulous anger at this unexpected complication. "Mrs. Lindquist, this is a matter of federal law enforcement, not community politics. Miss Harrington is a fugitive from territorial authority who must be brought to justice." "Agent Whitman," replied Eric Kowalski, whose son had struggled with reading difficulties until Sarah developed special techniques to help him succeed, "we've seen what Miss Harrington's teaching methods can accomplish. Our children are learning faster and better than they ever did under conventional approaches. If her methods work for Lakota children, perhaps they could work for all frontier children." The delegation's arrival transformed the nature of the confrontation. From a simple law enforcement action into a complex political situation that required careful handling. Federal authorities could arrest a single renegade teacher, but they could not easily dismiss the concerns of dozens of voting settlers whose support was crucial for territorial stability. Dr. Morrison, who had remained conflicted throughout the crisis, arrived the following day with news that would further complicate Whitman's position. "Agent Whitman," he announced, "I've received communications from the Territorial Medical Board regarding health conditions among reservation populations. The Lakota children in Miss Harrington's program are showing significantly better physical and psychological health markers than children in standard government schools." The medical evidence supporting Sarah's educational approach added scientific credibility to what her supporters had been arguing on moral and practical grounds. Children who learned in environments that respected their cultural identity were not only academically more successful, but physically healthier than those subjected to forced assimilation programs. Red Cloudwalker, who had been observing these developments with the strategic patience that had made him an effective leader, chose this moment to present his own proposal for resolving the crisis. "Agent Whitman," he said, "I believe we have an opportunity to transform this confrontation into something constructive for all parties involved." The Lakota chief outlined a comprehensive plan that would establish Sarah's educational program as a pilot project for developing new approaches to frontier education. The program would operate under joint oversight by tribal councils and territorial authorities, with regular evaluations to assess its effectiveness compared to conventional methods. "What you're proposing," Whitman said slowly, clearly calculating the political implications of various responses, "would require approval from territorial headquarters, possibly from Washington itself." "Yes," Red Cloud Walker agreed, "which means this decision will be made by officials who understand the larger political context of what we're trying to achieve here. Officials who recognize that successful education policy serves everyone's interests." Sarah realized that Red Cloud Walker was calling Whitman's bluff, forcing him to escalate the conflict to levels where political considerations would outweigh simple law enforcement concerns. Territorial and federal officials would have to weigh the benefits of maintaining rigid assimilation policies against the potential advantages of experimental approaches that might actually improve educational outcomes. The negotiation that followed extended through 2 weeks of complex discussions, involving federal officials, territorial representatives, tribal councils, and settler communities. Sarah found herself at the center of debates that ranged from practical education policy to fundamental questions about American identity and the future of cultural diversity in the expanding nation. The resolution, when it finally came, exceeded even Red Cloud Walker's ambitious expectations. Federal authorities agreed to designate Sarah's program as an official experimental education initiative, funded jointly by territorial and federal resources and subject to regular evaluation by independent educational experts. The program would be expanded to serve both Lakota and white children, creating the first truly integrated educational system in Dakota Territory. "Good Thunder Woman," Red Cloud Walker said during the ceremony that formally established the new school, "you have done more than save one child from a blizzard. You have created a new way for our peoples to understand each other." The school that emerged from this agreement became a model that attracted attention from educators throughout the American West and beyond. Students learned in an environment that celebrated cultural diversity while providing rigorous academic instruction. Lakota children maintained pride in their heritage while gaining skills that prepared them for success in the broader American society. White children developed understanding and respect for Native American cultures, while receiving educational experiences that were richer and more comprehensive than anything available in conventional frontier schools. Joseph Crow Feather, now a young man of 15, served as Sarah's primary assistant and translator, his bicultural fluency making him invaluable in bridging communication gaps between different student populations. His journey from a freezing child in a blizzard to a confident leader helping to build a new kind of educational community embodied the transformative potential that Sarah's approach represented. "Miss Sarah," Joseph said during one of their planning sessions for the school's third year of operation, "my grandfather used to tell stories about times when different tribes would come together for great councils, sharing knowledge and wisdom, for the benefit of all. I think that's what we've created here, a place where different kinds of knowledge can come together to make everyone stronger." The success of Sarah's educational experiment had implications that extended far beyond the classroom. The cooperative relationships built through the school began to influence broader interactions between white and Lakota communities throughout the territory. Trade relationships developed, cultural exchanges became common, and the threat of violent conflict that had dominated previous decades began to recede. Thunderhorse, who had initially been skeptical of Red Cloud Walker's diplomatic approach, became one of the program's strongest advocates after seeing its practical results. "Good Thunder Woman," he said during a community celebration marking the school's 5th anniversary, "you have proven that it is possible to preserve our way of life while building bridges to the white world. My own children are learning skills that will help them succeed in both worlds. And that is a gift I never expected to be able to give them." The personal cost of Sarah's transformation had been enormous. She could never return to the comfortable anonymity she had known in white society, and her choice to align herself with Lakota interests meant accepting permanent responsibility for outcomes that affected hundreds of lives. But the meaning and fulfillment she found in her new role exceeded anything she had experienced during her previous life as a conventional frontier teacher. As Sarah stood before the graduating class of 1891, looking out at faces that represented both Lakota and white families, she reflected on the remarkable chain of events that had transformed her from an isolated schoolteacher into a builder of communities and bridges between cultures. The young people before her possessed skills and understanding that prepared them for a future that honored their diverse heritages while equipping them for success in an evolving American society. 5 years ago, Sarah told the assembled graduates and their families, I made a simple choice to help a child who was dying in a snowstorm. That choice led to discoveries about courage, justice, and the possibility of building something better than the division and hatred that had characterized relations between our peoples. In the audience, she could see faces that represented the community that had grown around the school's innovative approach. Lakota families whose children had gained new opportunities without losing their cultural identity. White families whose children had developed understanding and respect for diversity that would serve them throughout their lives. Government officials who had learned that effective policy required cooperation rather than coercion. Today, Sarah continued, you are graduating not just with academic knowledge, but with the understanding that different cultures can learn from each other, that diversity makes communities stronger, and that the courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult, can change the world in ways we never expected. Joseph Crow Feather, now preparing to attend university while maintaining his role as a cultural bridge between communities, stepped forward to address the gathering in both Lakota and English. His presence on the platform represented the success of Sarah's vision, a young man completely comfortable in both worlds, prepared to carry forward the work of building understanding between peoples who had once considered each other enemies. The ceremony concluded and families began their celebrations. Sarah felt the presence of Red Cloud Walker beside her. The Lakota chief, now in his 60s but still commanding in his bearing, had become not just her adoptive father, but her closest collaborator in the ongoing work of cultural bridge building. Wakinyela Waste, he said, using the Lakota name that had become more real to her than the one she had been born with. When I first offered you a place in our family, I hoped you would help us find a path between resistance and surrender. You have done more than that. You have created a new path that neither of our peoples had imagined possible. Sarah looked out at the community that had grown around their shared vision, children playing together without regard for racial boundaries, families from different cultures sharing food and conversation, teachers and students engaged in the ongoing work of learning from each other. The storm that had brought Joseph to her door had indeed carried the seeds of transformation, growing into something far larger and more beautiful than anyone could have predicted. The blizzard that had started it all was long past, but the thunder of change it had brought continued to echo across Dakota territory and beyond, carried forward by young people who had learned that courage, compassion, and the willingness to see beyond artificial divisions could transform the world one relationship, one community, one generation at a time. The child she had rescued from a snowstorm had grown into a bridge between worlds, and the woman who had saved him had discovered that sometimes the most important historical changes begin with the simple decision to help another human being, regardless of the cost to ourselves or the barriers that others insist are too strong to cross. In the end, Good Thunder Woman had lived up to her name, bringing the kind of transformative change that shakes both earth and sky, creating new possibilities where none had existed before. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.